So there were congressional hearings in 1998. They were basically around the intelligence part of the Defense Appropriations Bill. One of the greatest resources I have for chronology of our involvement with the drug trade came from a group I've worked with in Washington, D.C. called the Institute for Policy Studies. And they came up with a report called A Tangled Web, and it was a chronology of CIA involvement with drug trafficking. It was submitted into the congressional record in 1998, and nothing became of it. Nothing. Nothing became of it. In 2004, Gary Webb allegedly committed suicide by shooting himself in the head twice. 2 years later, Mike Rupert had a complete and total breakdown and is in and out of mental hospitals in New York right now after trying to run away to Venezuela and being poisoned and almost dying. Another interesting wrinkle in this Contra cocaine story is about a CIA agent who was also a drug smuggler, who was also an informant for the DEA. His name was Barry Seal. And he used an organized trafficking network based out of a military airstrip in Mena, Arkansas. Arkansas became one of the main transit points of Central and South American cocaine coming into this country during the 80s. Seal was murdered in 1986, and in his suitcase, in his wallet, was a piece of paper with the private phone line of President George Herbert Walker Bush, that he was vice president at the time. Remember I said that the whole Contra operation was run out of the vice president's office, right? So this is where Dick Cheney got his model for how to control government through the vice presidency. The airstrip in Mena is considered one of the major transit points for cocaine, as I said, but apparently the Clintons profited quite handsomely from this. In exchange for allowing this trade to happen under their nose and covering it up, much of these drug proceeds were laundered through a group called, a corporation called the Arkansas Economic Development Corporation. And what it was set up to do was it laundered drug money, and then it became the Clintons' personal slush fund. So if anybody wanted to build something, if you wanted to do something in Arkansas, anywhere you wanted to build, you wanted to get land, you wanted to get loan, you wanted to get this, you had to go through this development corporation, which was the Clintons. You had to use Hillary Clinton's law firm to do all the legal work. And then they were able to use it machine style to create a political empire. If you look at this, under Clinton, there was never any serious investigation into Iran-Contra. I mean, you had the Kerry Commission in the 80s, and then Bush got into office and pardoned everybody who was in there, right, including himself. And then Clinton comes in and nobody picks up anything again, and nothing really comes of any of these investigations. It can be very easily understood that Clinton and Bush were part of this longer arc, this longer network that had to keep this defense military apparatus in place by keeping the drug trade in place. They benefited from it. They were probably two of the biggest traffickers if you look at keeping a system in place and making sure that it can operate. And that means there's continuity in the White House too. So why are Bush and Clinton always palling around together? It's because in many ways they've been in business together for a long time. As Mike Davis puts it, my favorite writer in the entire world, he says that Bush and Clinton sustained the core policies of Reaganism, albeit with a more human face. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So as to the question as to whether or not the CIA is dealing drugs to US citizens, it really, which we are going to examine in the next two sections, it really depends on how you frame the question, okay? So if you use the same standard that a journalist will apply, or as the Boston Globe put it, as the white establishment judged the allegations against the CIA with a scrutiny that you would only apply to scientific method. In order to prove the crack connection in Los Angeles to whites, the Boston Globe wrote, you have to have proof of a CIA agent with drugs on his back dropping off the drugs in the community. In other words, if your definition of dealing is standing on a street corner moving dime bags, then no, the CIA isn't dealing drugs, right? With that narrow standard, it's not surprising that there's no proof. But then think about the people who defined that standard in the first place. No one really made that claim. If you understand the 60-year alliance that we've had with drug traffickers and organized crime networks, you realize that the question is self-evident. The CIA isn't doing the grunt work. They're the stars of this marquee ensemble of international players around the world. They're way up on the food chain where the key sources exist. They protect those networks. They influence what happens inside and outside our borders. But the domestic distribution, the quote, dropping off the drugs in the community part, has always been left to the criminal organized networks, which were the mafias, the black and Latino street gangs, now the Russians, the Chinese, and the other groups that are moving in. Sometimes these groups would work together, sometimes they would not. So, if your definition of dealing is expanded to include activities, however direct or indirect, that led to the creation of international drug networks, that provide ongoing protection for these drug networks, and profit from the international drug trade, bing, bing, bing. We hit all three. And the answers there become pretty self-evident. So we're going to move on to the second part here, which is of the problem, reaction, solution paradigm, which is domestic policy and economics. And I want to open up with a quote from Noam Chomsky. And this is an old quote. It's about 10 years old, but it's still fairly resonant today. The United Nations tries to monitor the international drug trade, and their estimates are on the order of 400 to 500 billion, $500 billion a year, in trade alone, which makes it higher than oil, and makes it about 10% of world trade. Where this money comes and goes is mostly unknown, but it is generally estimated that maybe 60% of it passes through US banks. After that, a lot of it goes to offshore tax havens. It's so obscure that nobody monitors it, and nobody wants to. But the Commerce Department every year publishes figures on foreign direct investment, right? Where the US is going, where it's investing. And in the 90s, the big area was Latin America, Southeast Asia. It turns out that 1/4 of US foreign direct investment, what we invest in other countries, that's listed as an investment, is actually going to Bermuda, another 15% to the Bahamas, and another 10% to the Cayman Islands. So 40% of our foreign direct investment ends up in offshore tax havens and unregulated banking centers that can't be touched by anybody else. Now, they're not building steel factories in Panama and Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, so the most benign interpretation is that they're just tax havens. The less benign interpretation is that it's one way of passing illegal money into places where it won't be monitored. And that's not the task of the Justice Department. As Chomsky puts it, the task of the Justice Department is to go after a black kid in the ghetto who has a joint in his pocket. So, what's interesting about the war on drugs, quote, unquote, right, is that it was invented by Nixon at a historic period of transformation for both the American economy and its cultural landscape. In the early 30s, late 60s and early 70s, I'm sorry, not 30s, the late 60s, early 70s, major industrialized nations began moving their production from the global north to the global south. Cheap labor markets, you hear about this all the time. So this was pushing whole sections of the American workforce out of the economy, right? The first waves of deindustrialization hit the American cities during the Vietnam War at the same time that the war was draining the treasury. So social unrest was everywhere, riots were in the cities, demonstrations and general strikes on college campuses. After appealing to what he called the great silent majority of Americans out there, Nixon was elected in 1968 on a platform of restoring law and order and ending the war in Vietnam with honor. Two events during his first term would prove to be two of the most significant and influential decisions of any American president ever. The first was in 1970 when he created and passed the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Controlled Substances